The wind howled like a wounded wolf as Everett Lawson pressed his shoulder against the barn door, fighting to secure it against the blizzard's fury that had descended upon Platteville, Colorado with terrifying speed. Snow whipped through the air in blinding sheets, turning the February afternoon of 1881 into a world of white chaos. Everett had seen plenty of storms in his 28 years, but this one had come from nowhere, transformed the landscape in minutes, and showed no signs of mercy. His ranch sat 3 miles outside the small mining town, far enough that he preferred the isolation but close enough that he could get supplies when needed. Tonight, though, he might as well have been living at the end of the earth. He finally managed to secure the latch and turned toward his cabin, head down against the wind when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A cry, human and desperate, carried on the gale. Everett stopped, his heart suddenly pounding harder than it had when wrestling with the barn door. He strained his ears, wondering if the wind was playing tricks, but there it was again. Someone was out there. Without hesitation, he moved toward the sound, squinting against the snow that pelted his face like tiny knives. His boots sank deep into the accumulating drifts as he fought his way toward the edge of his property. The visibility was so poor he nearly stumbled over the figure collapsed just 20 yards from his front porch. A woman lay crumpled in the snow, her dark cloak already half buried, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt at warmth. Everett dropped to his knees beside her, his gloved hands reaching for her shoulders. "Can you hear me?" he shouted over the wind. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. He so rarely used it for anything beyond necessary words to his horses or the occasional transaction in town. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and even in the storm's chaos, he could see they were a striking shade of green. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She was conscious but clearly suffering from the cold. Without wasting another second, Everett scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her trembling through his coat. He carried her quickly to his cabin, shouldering the door open and kicking it shut behind him. The sudden absence of wind felt like a blessing. The fire he'd built earlier was still burning strong, casting the single-room cabin in warm, flickering light. He carried the woman to his bed in the corner and laid her down gently, immediately moving to remove her wet cloak. Her clothes underneath were damp but not soaked through, which was fortunate. She wore a simple gray traveling dress that had seen better days, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling in wet tangles around her pale face. Everett grabbed the extra blankets from his chest and piled them on top of her, then moved to the fire to heat water. His hands shook slightly as he filled his kettle and hung it over the flames. The adrenaline of the rescue was wearing off, replaced by a nervous uncertainty. He wasn't accustomed to company, especially not the company of a woman. Everett had lived alone for 5 years now, ever since he'd saved enough money working cattle drives to buy this small piece of land and build his cabin. He kept to himself, spoke only when necessary, and had grown comfortable with silence as his constant companion. The woman groaned, and Everett turned to see her eyes open again. She looked around the cabin with confusion and fear, her body tensing beneath the blankets. "You are safe," Everett said quickly, the words feeling thick and awkward in his mouth. "Found you outside. Storm." She stared at him, her green eyes wide, then slowly relaxed back against the pillow. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and thin. "I thought I was going to die out there." Everett nodded, unsure what else to say. He turned back to the fire, checking the water. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different from his usual solitude. It felt charged, heavy with unasked questions. "My name is Zara Griffith," the woman said after a moment. I was trying to reach town when the storm hit. My horse threw me about a mile back. I tried to find shelter, but everything looked the same. I just kept walking." "Everett Lawson," he replied, not turning from the fire. "This is my ranch. Platteville is 3 miles east." 3 miles, Zara repeated with a weak laugh. "I must have been going in circles. I'm lucky you found me." The kettle began to steam, and Everett poured hot water into a cup, adding some tea leaves from his meager supply. He brought it to her, and when their fingers brushed as she took the cup, he felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the cold. Her hands were still icy, and he frowned. "Need to warm up more," he said, his brow furrowing. "Can make soup." "You don't have to go to any trouble," Zara said, wrapping her hands around the cup. "You have already saved my life." "No trouble," Everett replied, already moving to his small pantry. He had beans, some salt pork, and vegetables he'd bought in town last week. It wasn't much, but he could make something warm and filling. As he worked, he could feel Zara's eyes on him, and it made him acutely aware of every movement. He wasn't used to being watched. The cabin that had always felt adequate now seemed small and rough. His bed, his table, his single chair, the sparse shelves, everything looked poor and primitive in the presence of this unexpected guest. "Have you lived here long?" Zara asked, her voice stronger now that she'd had some warm tea. 5 years, Everett replied, chopping the salt pork with more precision than necessary. "By yourself," he nodded. "That must be lonely," she said softly. Everett paused in his chopping, considering her words. Was it lonely? He'd never really thought about it that way. After growing up in a crowded orphanage in Denver, then spending years on cattle drives surrounded by loud, boisterous cowboys, the solitude had felt like relief. He'd never been good with words, never been able to participate in the easy banter that others seemed to manage so naturally. Out here alone, he didn't have to worry about that. He could just exist. "Used to it," he finally said, resuming his work. He heard Zara shift on the bed, the blankets rustling. "I think I understand that. Sometimes silence is easier than trying to find the right words." Everett glanced at her in surprise. She was looking at him with an expression of understanding that made something in his chest tighten. He quickly looked away and focused on adding the ingredients to his pot. As the soup began to bubble and fill the cabin with a savory aroma, Everett finally allowed himself to really look at his unexpected guest. Even disheveled and exhausted, Zara was beautiful. Her dark hair was beginning to dry in the fire's warmth, curling slightly around her face. Her green eyes were alert and intelligent, watching the storm rage outside his single window. She looked to be in her mid-20s, and there was something in the set of her jaw that spoke of determination and strength. "Where were you headed?" Everett asked, the question surprising himself as much as it seemed to surprise her. "To Platteville, I mean." "Why?" Zara's expression clouded. "I was hoping to find work. I've been traveling for weeks, moving from town to town. I heard Platteville might need a school teacher or at least someone who could help with the children. I taught back in Missouri before." She trailed off, her fingers tightening on the cup. Everett didn't press, recognizing the look of someone with a painful past. He had his own ghosts and knew better than to poke at other people's wounds. "Town does need a teacher," he offered. "Last one left in the fall. Got married, moved to Denver." Zara's face brightened. "Really? Then maybe I haven't come all this way for nothing." The hope in her voice made Everett want to protect it, to make sure it didn't get crushed. The feeling was foreign and a little unsettling. He ladled soup into 2 bowls and brought one to her, along with a spoon. "Thank you," Zara said, accepting the bowl. She took a sip and her eyes widened. "This is delicious. I haven't had a hot meal in days." Everett felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. He sat at his table with his own bowl, eating in silence while Zara did the same. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind screaming around the cabin's corners. He knew from experience that a storm like this could last for days. The thought of Zara being stranded here filled him with both anxiety and something else he didn't want to examine too closely. "The storm," he said slowly, forcing himself to meet her eyes, "might last a while, could be days. You will need to stay here." Zara set down her empty bowl, her expression troubled. "I don't want to impose on your hospitality any more than I already have. Surely by morning the storm will have passed and I can make my way to town." Everett shook his head firmly. "No, too dangerous. February storms in the mountains can last 3-4 days. Even when it stops, snow will be too deep to travel safely." He could see the worry in her eyes and understood it. She was alone with a strange man in an isolated cabin. Despite the fact that he'd saved her life, she had no reason to trust him. The realization that she might be afraid of him made his stomach twist. "You can have the bed," he said quickly. "I will sleep by the fire. You are safe here, I promise." Zara studied his face for a long moment, and Everett tried not to squirm under the scrutiny. Finally, she nodded. "I believe you, and thank you for everything." The tension in the cabin eased slightly. Everett collected their bowls and cleaned them in his wash basin while Zara settled back under the blankets. The firelight played across the walls, and the storm's howl became a constant backdrop to the strange new dynamic in his home. "Can I ask you something?" Zara said after a while. Everett dried his hands and turned to face her. "Yes. Why do you live out here alone? I don't mean to pry, but you seem like a good man. Most men want companionship, a family." Everett felt his chest tighten. It was the kind of question he'd avoided thinking about for years. He moved to sit by the fire, staring into the flames as he searched for words. "Not good with people," he said finally. "Never have been. Words don't come easy. Growing up, other kids learned to talk, to joke, to make friends. I just stayed quiet. Easier that way. Out here, don't need words. Can just work, take care of things, don't disappoint anyone." The admission felt like pulling splinters from under his skin, painful and relieving at the same time. He'd never said any of that out loud before. "I don't think you are disappointing anyone now," Zara said softly. "You saved my life today with your actions, not your words. That speaks louder than anything you could say." Everett looked at her, surprised by the emotion in her voice. Her eyes were shining in the firelight, and she was looking at him like he was something more than he'd ever thought himself to be. "Just did what anyone would do," he mumbled. "No," Zara said firmly. "Not everyone would have heard me over that storm. Not everyone would have come out into the blizzard to look. Not everyone would have opened their home to a stranger. You did all of that. You are a good man, Everett Lawson, whether you use a lot of words or not." The warmth that spread through his chest had nothing to do with the fire. Everett didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded and turned back to the flames. But something had shifted in the cabin, in the space between them. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or empty. It felt full, comfortable, like a language they both understood. As the night deepened, Everett added more wood to the fire and made sure Zara had enough blankets. He rolled out his bedroll near the hearth and lay down, acutely aware of her presence just a dozen feet away. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady, and found it oddly soothing. "Everett." Zara's voice came soft through the darkness. "Yes, thank you, for not making me feel foolish or weak, for just helping." "Sleep," he said gently. Tomorrow the storm might be better, but he knew it wouldn't be. The wind's howl told him this blizzard was settling in for a long stay. And as he lay in the firelight, listening to Zara drift off to sleep, he found he didn't mind the prospect as much as he probably should have. Morning came gray and white. the world outside completely transformed. Snow had piled against the cabin's walls in massive drifts, and it was still falling steadily. Everett woke to find Zara already up, standing at the window and looking out at the transformed landscape. "I have never seen anything like this," she said as he sat up. "In Missouri we had snow, but never like this." Everett stood and moved to join her at the window. The barn was barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. His horses would need tending, and soon. "Have to check the animals," he said. "Might take a while." Zara turned to him with concern. "Is it safe?" "Have a rope," he explained, gesturing to the coiled line by the door. "Tie one end to the cabin, follow it to the barn and back. Won't get lost." "That seems dangerous," Zara said, her brow furrowed. "Animals need care," Everett replied simply. It wasn't a matter of choice. His 2 horses and the handful of chickens in the barn depended on him. He'd never neglected them and wasn't about to start now. He pulled on his heavy coat and wrapped a scarf around his face, then secured one end of the rope to a hook beside the door. Zara watched him with worried eyes. "Be careful," she said. The simple words, spoken with genuine concern, made his heart skip. He nodded and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, and within seconds he could barely see the cabin behind him. He kept one hand on the rope and pushed forward, each step an effort as the snow tried to pull him down. It took him nearly 15 minutes to reach the barn, though normally it was a 2-minute walk. Inside, his horses whinnied nervously. He spent an hour making sure they had fresh water from the melted snow he'd hauled in, plenty of hay, and that the barn was secure. The chickens were huddled together for warmth, and he scattered feed for them, checking their roost for eggs. The journey back to the cabin was even harder, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to push him off course. When he finally stumbled through the door, covered in snow and ice, Zara rushed to help him. "You are freezing," she exclaimed, her hands working at the frozen scarf around his face. "Come to the fire. Quickly." Everett let her lead him to the hearth, too cold and exhausted to protest. She helped him out of his coat and pushed him down onto his bedroll, piling blankets around him. Then she pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands. "I found your coffee tin," she said. "I hope you don't mind that I made some." "No, thank you." Everett wrapped his hands around the cup, grateful for the warmth. He hadn't expected to find someone fussing over him when he got back, and the feeling was strange but not unwelcome. Zara sat beside him, her own cup in hand. "The animals are all right." "Yes, safe and fed. Storm is worse than yesterday." "How long do you think we will be trapped here?" Everett considered the question, listening to the wind. 3 days at least, maybe 4. Zara nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "Then we should make the best of it, and I should help. I can't just sit here while you do all the work." "Not much to do," Everett said. "Stay warm. Stay safe." "There must be something," Zara insisted. "I could cook. Do you have any mending? I'm good with a needle." Everett thought about his shirts, most of which had tears or missing buttons. He'd never bothered to fix them properly, just made do with rough repairs when absolutely necessary. "Some shirts need work," he admitted. "But you don't have to." "I want to," Zara said firmly. "You saved my life and opened your home to me. The least I can do is help maintain it while I'm here." There was no arguing with that tone, and truthfully, Everett didn't want to argue. Having Zara here, talking to him, looking at him with those green eyes, it made the cabin feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Over the next few hours, they fell into an easy rhythm. Zara found his sewing kit and set to work on his shirts while Everett carved some new pegs for his coat hooks, a task he'd been putting off for weeks. They worked in comfortable silence, broken occasionally by small observations or questions. "You make that look easy," Zara said, watching him carve. Did someone teach you? Taught myself, Everett replied, examining the peg he was working on. Books mostly, and practice. You like to read. There was surprise and pleasure in her voice. Everett felt his face warm. Yes, have some books. He gestured to the small shelf where he kept his precious collection of a dozen volumes. Some bought, others traded for work. Zara stood and moved to examine them, running her fingers over the spines. Mark Twain, James Fenimore Cooper, some Dickens. These are wonderful. I love to read too. It was one of the reasons I wanted to teach, to share that love with children. Why did you leave Missouri? The question was out before Everett could stop it, bold and intrusive. Sorry, don't have to answer. Zara was quiet for a moment, still looking at the books. It's all right. I was engaged to be married. He was a banker's son, respectable and established. Everyone thought it was a good match. But a few weeks before the wedding, I discovered he already had a wife in Kansas City. He'd never intended to actually marry me, just wanted to keep me as a mistress while maintaining his proper family elsewhere. Everett felt anger flare in his chest, hot and protective. That is terrible. You deserved better. I thought so too, Zara said with a sad smile. But my family blamed me. Said I must have done something to make him treat me that way, that I should have been grateful for any offer at all. So I left. I'd rather make my own way in the world than stay where I'm not valued. The strength in her words, the determination in her voice, it made Everett see her in a new light. She wasn't just a woman he'd rescued from a storm. She was someone who'd been knocked down and chosen to stand back up on her own terms. They were wrong, he said firmly. Your family. They were wrong to blame you. You did nothing wrong. Zara turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Thank you for saying that. You have no idea how much I needed to hear it from someone. The moment stretched between them, charged with emotion and something deeper. Everett wanted to say more, to tell her that anyone who couldn't see her worth was a fool, but the words tangled in his throat as they always did. Instead, he just held her gaze, hoping she could see what he couldn't say. Zara wiped at her eyes and smiled. I think we both ended up in the right place, don't you? You out here where you don't need to perform for anyone, and me on my way to somewhere new where I can start fresh. Yes, Everett agreed, though the thought of her moving on to town and out of his life caused an unexpected pang in his chest. That afternoon, as the storm continued to rage, they shared more stories. Zara told him about growing up in a busy household with 4 siblings, about learning to love books despite her mother's insistence that too much reading would make her unmarriageable, about the school she'd taught at for 2 years before everything fell apart. Everett found himself talking more than he had in years, telling her about growing up in the orphanage, about the long cattle drives and the cowboys who taught him to work hard and keep his head down, about saving every penny until he could buy this land and build his dream of a quiet, simple life. But don't you ever want more? Zara asked, her mending forgotten in her lap. Someone to share it with? Everett stared into the fire, considering. Sometimes, he admitted, but wanting and having are different things. Wouldn't know how to be with someone, how to talk enough, how to be enough. I think you're more than enough, Zara said softly. These past 2 days I've felt more understood and valued than I did in months with my former fiancé. You listen when I talk. You care about what I say. You don't need to fill every silence with empty words. That's a gift, Everett. He looked at her, his heart pounding. She was watching him with an expression so tender it made his breath catch. Without thinking, he reached out and took her hand. It was small and warm in his, her fingers curling around his naturally. You make it easy, he said, his voice rough with emotion. To talk, to be. Zara squeezed his hand. You do the same for me. They sat like that as the fire crackled and the storm howled, hands clasped. something profound and fragile taking shape between them. By the third day, the storm finally began to ease. The snow had stopped falling, though the wind still whipped the drifts into new formations. Everett knew it would be at least another day before the path to town would be passable, maybe two. He should have been relieved. Instead, he felt a growing sense of dread. Once the storm cleared, Zara would leave. She'd go to town, find a place to stay, hopefully secure the teaching position, and move on with her life. And he would go back to his quiet, solitary existence. Except now the silence felt different. His cabin, which had been his refuge, suddenly seemed empty even with Zara still in it. How had that happened in just 3 days? How had this woman become so essential to him in such a short time? Zara seemed to sense his mood. She'd been quieter today, watching him with thoughtful eyes as he went about his chores. When he came back from his morning trip to the barn, she'd made breakfast and set it out on the table. "Sit," she said. "We need to talk." Everett's heart sank. He sat down across from her, barely tasting the food as he waited for her to speak. "The storm is clearing," Zara said, stating the obvious. "Soon I'll be able to get to town." Everett nodded, not trusting his voice. "I've been thinking a lot," Zara continued, "about what I want. What I'm looking for. I came out here to start fresh, to find somewhere I could belong and build a new life." "You will make a good teacher," Everett managed. "The children will be lucky to have you." "Maybe," Zara said, "but these past few days I've realized something. I don't just want a job or a place to live. I want a home. A real home with someone who sees me, who values me for who I am. Someone who doesn't need me to be anything other than myself." Everett's hands clenched on the table. "You deserve that. You deserve everything." "I think I might have found it," Zara said softly. "Here, with you." Everett's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers in disbelief. "What?" "I know it's sudden," Zara said, her words coming faster now. "I know we've only known each other for 3 days, but sometimes you just know, don't you? When something is right. These have been the best days I've had in years. I feel safe with you. I feel seen. I don't want to go to town and pretend to start fresh when everything I want is right here." "You want to stay?" Everett could barely get the words out. "Here, with me." "If you want me," Zara said, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked uncertain, vulnerable. "I know it's asking a lot. I know you value your solitude, but I think we could be good together. I think we already are." Everett stood up so abruptly his chair nearly tipped over. He moved around the table and dropped to his knees in front of Zara, taking both her hands in his. "Want you to stay more than anything," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "These days with you here, I've been happier than I can remember. Thought I wanted to be alone, but I was wrong. I just needed the right person. You are the right person. You make everything better, make me better." Tears spilled down Zara's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated because you rescued me." "Not obligation," Everett said firmly. "Want you here because you make this place feel like home. Make me feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. Please stay." Zara slid off her chair and into his arms, and Everett held her tight, his face buried in her hair. She smelled like his soap and the herbs she'd found in his pantry, and underneath it all, something uniquely her. He never wanted to let go. "I'll stay," Zara whispered against his shoulder. "I'll stay as long as you want me." "Forever," Everett said without hesitation. "Want you forever." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped up in each other on the floor of his cabin while the storm's final gusts rattled the windows. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "We are going to have to figure out how to make this work," Zara said, wiping at her eyes. "We'll need a real bed eventually, maybe expand the cabin. And I should still try for that teaching position if you don't mind. I'd like to contribute." "We can build whatever you need," Everett said. And yes, teach. You'll be amazing. We will figure everything out, together. The word felt foreign and wonderful on his tongue. Together. He wasn't alone anymore. Over the next week, as the snow slowly melted enough for travel, they made plans. Everett would take Zara into town to meet with the town council about the teaching position. They'd need to be married first, of course. It was 1881, and propriety mattered, especially for a schoolteacher. Neither of them minded. What had started as an unexpected rescue had blossomed into something neither of them wanted to question or delay. The day the road finally cleared enough for travel, they rode into Platteville together on Everett's horse, Zara sitting in front of him, wrapped in his arms. The town was small but bustling, miners and ranchers mixing on the main street. Everett felt his usual anxiety at being around so many people, but with Zara beside him, it was manageable. They went first to the minister's house. Reverend Thomas was a kind man in his 50s who listened to their story with gentle eyes. "It's unusual," he admitted. "But then again, I've seen many unusual starts to marriages in my time out here, and some of the best unions I've witnessed came from the most unexpected circumstances. If you're both certain, I'll marry you." "We are certain," Zara said, her hand tight in Everett's. "Very certain," Everett added, and the minister smiled. They were married in the small church an hour later, with the minister's wife and the town doctor as witnesses. Everett had never been good with words, but when it came time for his vows, he looked into Zara's green eyes and found the right ones. "I promise to give you a home where you're always safe, always valued, and always heard. Promise to work hard to make you happy. Promise to love you with everything I have, even if I don't always have the words to say it." Zara's vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to be your partner in building the life we both want. Promise to never make you feel like you need to be anyone other than who you are. Promise to love you through the quiet moments and the loud ones, through storms and sunshine for the rest of my life." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Everett he could kiss his bride, Everett cupped Zara's face gently in his hands and kissed her with all the emotion he'd kept bottled up for so long. It was tender and passionate, full of promise and hope. After the ceremony, they went to the town council meeting. Zara impressed them immediately with her knowledge and passion for teaching. The fact that she was now a married woman with a respectable rancher for a husband only helped her case. They offered her the position on the spot, though she wouldn't start until after the winter, once the weather improved enough for children to travel to the schoolhouse regularly. "That gives us time," Zara said excitedly as they rode back to the ranch. "Time to settle in, to expand the cabin like we talked about." "Already have plans drawn up," Everett admitted. "Started them last night. Want to add a real bedroom, make the cabin bigger. Maybe add a room for teaching if you want to take on private students in bad weather." Zara twisted in the saddle to look at him, her eyes shining. "You drew up plans. You've been thinking about this." "Been thinking about a lot of things," Everett said. "About what it would be like to share my life with someone, with you. Want to make this place as much yours as it is mine." "It already is," Zara said softly. "Home isn't a building, Everett. It's wherever you are." Those words, simple and true, settled into Everett's heart and made a place for themselves there. The weeks that followed were some of the best of Everett's life. During the days, when the weather allowed, he worked on expanding the cabin. Several ranchers from neighboring properties came to help, curious about the quiet man's sudden marriage. Zara charmed them all with her warmth and wit, making meals for the workers and helping where she could. Everett found himself talking more, drawn out by Zara's easy conversation and the way she made everyone feel welcome. He'd never been social, but with Zara beside him, it felt less daunting. "You're good with people," Zara told him one evening as they lay in their new bed in the newly completed bedroom. "You just never believed you could be." "Only because of you," Everett said, pulling her closer. "You make everything better." "We make each other better," Zara corrected, kissing him softly. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, life on the ranch found its rhythm. Zara started teaching in April, riding into town 3 days a week to work with the children. She came home full of stories about her students, about their progress and their challenges. Everett loved watching her face light up as she talked, loved being the person she chose to share her day with. In turn, he told her about the ranch work, about his plans to expand the herd, about the new foals he was expecting from his mares. They were small, ordinary conversations, but they felt profound to Everett. This was what he'd been missing all those years alone, not just someone to talk to, but someone who cared about what he had to say. By summer, the ranch was thriving. Everett had bought 3 more horses and started breeding them, something he'd always wanted to do. Zara's teaching was going so well that the town council asked her to take on additional students and extend her days. "I don't want to be away from home too much," she told Everett, worrying her lip. "I love teaching, but I love being here with you too." "Do what makes you happy," Everett said. "I'll be here when you get back. Always." They compromised, with Zara teaching 4 days a week and occasionally taking on a private student at the ranch on the weekends. The cabin that had once been so quiet now rang with the sounds of life, laughter, conversation, and love. One evening in late July, as they sat on the new porch Everett had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Zara took his hand. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice soft but excited. Everett looked at her, noting the glow in her cheeks, the brightness in her eyes. His heart started to pound. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant," Zara said, her smile wide and beautiful. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Everett couldn't breathe. A baby, a child. His child, their child. The thought was overwhelming, terrifying, and absolutely wonderful all at once. "Are you sure?" he managed. "I've been sure for a few weeks," Zara admitted. "I wanted to wait until I was certain to tell you. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday when I went to town. The baby should come in late February or early March. February. The same month she'd come into his life, the same month that had changed everything." "A baby," Everett said, and then he was laughing, pulling Zara into his arms and spinning her around. "We are going to have a baby." Zara laughed with him, her arms tight around his neck. "Are you happy?" "Happier than I knew I could be," Everett said, setting her down gently and placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "Never thought I'd have this, a wife, a family, a real home." "You deserve it all," Zara said, covering his hand with hers. "You deserve everything good in this world, Everett Lawson." The months of Zara's pregnancy were both challenging and joyful. She had some difficult days in the beginning, but Everett was there for all of it, learning to make ginger tea and keeping crackers by the bedside, holding her hair when she was sick and rubbing her feet when they swelled. Zara had to stop teaching by December, as travel became too difficult and she was too far along. The children and their parents threw her a lovely farewell party, promising to welcome her back after the baby came. "They love you," Everett observed as they drove home that evening, the wagon full of gifts for the baby. "I love them too," Zara said, a hand on her rounded belly. "But I'm ready to be home for a while, ready to focus on our family." Everett reached over and took her hand, marveling as he always did that this was his life now. That he had someone to love and who loved him back, that they were bringing a new life into the world together. The baby came on a snowy night in early March, a year after Zara had stumbled into Everett's life. Dr. Morrison made it to the ranch just in time, and after hours of labor, their son was born. He was small and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that worked remarkably well. "He's beautiful," Zara said, exhausted but glowing as she held their son. Everett sat beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, looking down at the tiny face. "He's perfect. You're perfect. Can't believe he's ours." "What should we name him?" Zara asked. They discussed names for months but never settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Everett thought about the storm that had brought Zara to him, about how something that seemed like a disaster had actually been the greatest blessing of his life. "Winter," he said. "Winter Jack Lawson. Because he came in winter and because something beautiful can come from something harsh." "Winter," Zara repeated, smiling. "I love it. Hello, Winter. Welcome home, little one." As Everett held his wife and son, watching the snow fall outside their window, he thought about how far he'd come. A year ago, he'd been alone, convinced he was better off that way. Now he had a family, a real home filled with love and laughter and noise. He'd found his voice, not because he'd learned to talk more, but because Zara had helped him understand that there were many ways to speak, and his actions had always been eloquent. The years that followed were full and rich. Winter grew into a curious, energetic boy who loved the horses and followed his father everywhere. Zara went back to teaching when Winter was a year old, taking him with her to the schoolhouse where he played while she taught. 2 years after Winter, they had a daughter they named Summer Rose, a sunny-natured child with her mother's green eyes. Everett expanded the ranch steadily, his horse breeding operation becoming well known throughout Colorado. He hired help as needed, finding to his surprise that he'd become comfortable managing people. Zara credited it to the fact that he treated everyone with the same quiet respect he showed to everything in his life. When Winter was 5 and Summer 3, they built a proper schoolhouse on their property. Zara taught there 3 days a week, serving children from surrounding ranches. The other days, she taught in town. The Lawson Ranch became known as a place of learning and welcome, always open to neighbors in need. Everett never became a talker, but he no longer felt like he was missing something. With Zara, he'd learned that communication went deeper than words. It was in the way he braided her hair every morning before she went to teach, in the careful way he carved toys for their children, in the gentle hands he used with the horses he trained, in the way he held Zara every night and told her with his body what he sometimes still struggled to say with words. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Everett surprised Zara with a gift he'd been working on for months. It was a book, hand-bound, filled with his careful handwriting and sketches. "What is this?" Zara asked, taking it carefully. "Our story," Everett said. "Wrote it down, every important moment. From the night you came through that storm to now, wanted you to have it, wanted our children to know how their parents fell in love." Zara opened the book with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears as she read his words. "Everett, this is beautiful. I didn't know you wrote like this." "Been practicing," he admitted. "Wanted to get better at putting feelings into words. For you, for them." He gestured to where Winter and Summer were playing in the next room. "You've always been good at showing your feelings," Zara said, closing the book and setting it aside so she could pull him close. "But this gift, these words, they're precious to me. Thank you." "Thank you," Everett replied, meaning it with everything he had. "For seeing me, for loving me, for giving me all of this." "We gave it to each other," Zara said, kissing him softly. "That's what love is, isn't it? Building something beautiful together." As they stood in their home, their children's laughter echoing through the rooms, the setting sun streaming through the windows, Everett thought about that night 10 years ago. The blizzard that had seemed like an ending had actually been a beginning. It had brought Zara to his door and changed everything. He thought about the quiet man he'd been, convinced he had nothing to offer, and the man he'd become, learned that his quiet strength was its own kind of voice. Zara hadn't just brought love into his life. She'd brought understanding, acceptance, and the courage to believe he deserved both. Over the years, they faced challenges as all families do. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick livestock and financial worries. But they faced everything together, their bond growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Everett learned that having a partner meant never being alone in the struggle, and Zara learned that strength came in many forms, including the quiet, steadfast presence of a man who showed his love in countless daily actions. When winter was 10 and summer 8, they welcomed another daughter, Pearl Grace, named after Zara's grandmother. 3 years later came their youngest, a son they called River Thomas, for the river that ran through their property and the minister who'd married them. Their home was always full of life and love. Zara continued teaching, becoming one of the most respected educators in the region. Students who'd learned under her care often came back to visit, bringing their own children to meet the woman who taught them to love learning. Everett's reputation as a horse breeder spread beyond Colorado. His animals were known for their intelligence and gentleness, traits that reflected the patient, kind way he trained them. He taught his children everything he knew, and Winter in particular showed a natural gift for working with horses. On quiet evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was peaceful, Everett and Zara would sit on their porch, watching the stars come out over the mountains. Sometimes they talked, sharing thoughts and dreams and plans. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, content in each other's presence. "You ever think about that night?" Zara asked one such evening, a warm summer night when they were both in their 40s. "The night we met, all the time," Everett admitted. "Best storm I ever saw." Zara laughed, the sound as beautiful to him now as it had been the first time he'd heard it. "It brought me home. I was so lost, Everett, not just physically, though I certainly was that too. I was lost in every way that mattered, and you found me." "We found each other," Everett said, pulling her closer. "You found me too. Didn't even know I was lost until you showed me what it meant to be found." As the years continued to pass, their children grew and began lives of their own. Winter took over more and more of the horse breeding operation, eventually bringing home a wife, a smart, kind young woman named Alice who fit into the family perfectly. Summer became a teacher like her mother, opening a school in a nearby town. Pearl showed a gift for healing and went to study nursing in Denver, coming home whenever she could. River, their youngest, developed a love for writing and worked for the newspaper in Platteville. Through it all, Everett and Zara remained the center, the foundation upon which their family was built. Their love, which had sparked in the midst of a blizzard and grown despite all logic and reason, proved stronger than any storm. When Everett was 55, a younger rancher asked him the secret to his success, to his happy family and thriving ranch. Everett had thought about it carefully before answering. "Found the right partner," he'd said simply. "Someone who made me better than I was alone. Someone I could make better too. That's all anyone needs." The young rancher had clearly expected more, some wisdom about business or ranching, but Zara, who'd been listening, had smiled and taken Everett's hand. "He's right," she'd said. "Everything else flows from that. When you have love and partnership, you can weather any storm and build anything you dream of." On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from all over, filling their home and property with celebration. As Everett looked around at all these people, at the life he and Zara had built together, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone home and they were finally alone, Zara found him in the barn. He was checking on a mare that was due to foal any day, but he looked up and smiled when she entered. "Hiding?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "Thinking," Everett replied, putting his arm around her, "about how lucky I am, how different my life could have been." "But this is how it was meant to be," Zara said. "I truly believe that. Every choice, every step led us both to that night, and I wouldn't change a single thing." "Neither would I," Everett agreed. "You gave me everything, Zara, a voice when I thought I didn't have one. A home when I thought I was content alone. A family I never dreamed I'd have. A life worth living." "You gave me all those things too," Zara said, tears in her eyes. "You gave me a place where I could be myself without apology. You taught me that love doesn't have to be loud to be real, that actions speak louder than words, that the quietest hearts often love the deepest." They stood together in the barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses and the sweet smell of hay, and kissed as deeply and passionately as they had on their wedding day 25 years ago. The years continued their march forward. Everett and Zara grew older together, their hair turning silver, their faces gaining lines earned from years of laughter and love. They became grandparents and then great-grandparents, their family tree spreading wide and strong. The ranch remained in the family, passed from generation to generation, but the heart of it was always the story of Everett and Zara, the quiet cowboy and the woman the blizzard brought to his door. Their love story became legend in the family, told and retold to each new generation as an example of how love could bloom in the most unexpected places and times. When Everett was 72, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. The doctors were worried, but Zara never left his side, nursing him with the same fierce determination she'd shown for everything in their life together. He pulled through, and when he was recovered, he held her hand and spoke words that had come easily to him for decades now. "Don't know what I'd do without you," he said. "You're my whole world, Zara, always have been." "And you're mine," Zara replied. "From the moment you carried me through that storm, you've been my whole world." They were blessed with many more years together. On warm evenings, they could be found on their porch, watching the sunset over the mountains they'd called home for more than half a century. Sometimes grandchildren or great-grandchildren would be there with them, listening to stories of the old days, of how the ranch came to be, of how their great-grandparents met during a blizzard that became the greatest blessing of both their lives. Everett passed away peacefully in his sleep at 81, with Zara beside him as she'd been for 53 years. He left behind a legacy of love, hard work, and quiet strength. His funeral was attended by hundreds, from family to friends to people whose lives he'd touched through his horses, his kindness, and his example. Zara lived for 3 more years after Everett's passing. In those years, she wrote down more of their story, expanding on the book Everett had made for their 10th anniversary. She wanted to make sure that future generations understood not just what had happened, but what it had meant. How 2 people who'd been lost and alone had found each other and built something beautiful. She passed away on a snowy February evening, almost exactly 56 years after the night Everett had found her in the blizzard. Her children were with her, and as she drew her last breath, she smiled. "I'm coming, Everett," she whispered. "Wait for me." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under 2 tall pines they'd planted together in their first spring as husband and wife. The headstone bore both their names and a simple inscription chosen by their children. "Love found in a storm, lasting through all seasons." The ranch continued to thrive under the care of their descendants, and the love story of Everett and Zara lived on. It was told at family gatherings and written about in local history books. It became a symbol of hope for anyone who felt lost or alone, a reminder that sometimes the worst storms brought the greatest blessings. Years after they were both gone, a great-granddaughter of theirs, studying family history, found the books they'd written, Everett's careful account and Zara's expansive remembrances. She read them with tears streaming down her face, amazed by the depth of love captured in those pages. She decided to have the books published, sharing her great-grandparents' story with the world. It became a local bestseller, and people from all over came to visit the ranch to see where this legendary love story had taken place. But the ranch itself, still in the family, still thriving, was the real testament to what Everett and Zara had built. It stood as proof that love could transform lives, that partnership could weather any storm, and that sometimes the quiet voices spoke the loudest of all. The current owners, descendants 5 generations removed from Everett and Zara, often stood on that same porch where their ancestors had spent so many evenings. They looked out over the land that had been worked and loved for over a century, and they understood that they were stewards of more than just property. They were guardians of a legacy of love. And on February nights, when the snow fell heavy and the wind howled around the buildings, some swore they could feel the presence of Everett and Zara, watching over the home they'd built together. It was a comforting feeling, a reminder that true love never really ended. It just transformed, becoming part of the very foundation of the places and people it had touched. The story of the quiet cowboy who found his voice, and the woman the blizzard brought to his door lived on, a beacon of hope and love for all who heard it. It reminded people that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places, that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, and that 2 hearts, no matter how broken or lonely they'd been, could come together and create something beautiful that would last for generations. In the end, that was their greatest gift, not the ranch they'd built or the family they'd raised, though both were impressive. Their greatest gift was the example they'd set, showing everyone who came after them what love could be when it was patient, kind, enduring, and true. They showed that you didn't need to be loud or flashy to have a profound impact. Sometimes the quietest love stories were the most powerful ones. And so the ranch continued, generation after generation, built on a foundation of love that had started with a blizzard, a stranger at the door, and a quiet cowboy who found that he'd been missing someone to love all along. The story would never end as long as there were people to remember it, to tell it, to live by the example it set. Everett and Zara's love had become eternal, woven into the fabric of their family and the land they'd called home.